Hello, I'm Lel Smits for the Finance News Network, and joining me today is the Minister for Finance and Deregulation, Penny Wong. Penny, thank you so much for joining us today.
It's great to be here.
Now, first up to the Australian share market, how would you rate the S&P ASX 200 index's performance this year?
Well, I think the first thing we should look at is the performance of the Australian economy, because that's the backdrop to different forms of investment, and the economy is performing very well. We've got an economy growing at or above trend, contained inflation, low interest rates, strong public finances, and a very large pipeline of investment, some $500 billion of investment in resources in this country, a big tick of confidence in the Australian economy. And if you look overseas, there's really no other economy that you'd rather be in.
Back to the S&P ASX 200, does the government have any projections as to where you believe it will trade or end this year?
Oh, well, I'd be a brave person to predict that. Look, what I would say is there's no doubt that the global financial crisis hit equities worldwide and certainly in Australia. But again, you have to come back to the economic fundamentals, where the economy's at, and there is a lot of economic strength in Australia. And I think you also have to look to where Australia is positioned in the Asian century, where our proximity to Asia, our proximity to that growing market really positions us very well for the years ahead.
Certainly. Now, in China, investors also seem to be concerned about a prolonged slowdown in the region, leading to the question, is the government concerned at all about an over-reliance on the resources sector here?
Look, can I start first by saying I'm more of an optimist on China than some people, and I think that growth has moderated in China, but it's still very strong growth, and probably reflects the rebalancing of the Chinese economy that the Chinese authorities have been saying they wanted. So an economy that is driven a bit more by consumption and a bit less by investment than it has previously. So that's a good thing in terms of the sustainability of growth. But I think it is important to recognise what China, what South Korea, what Vietnam, what Indonesia, Malaysia, what they represent to Australia is not just economies that seek our resources. They're also economies where we'll see more and more people enter the middle class, more and more people wanting the goods and services that Australians want. And that represents an enormous market opportunity for us. And the numbers are interesting. There's about 500 million people in the Asia-Pacific region that you'd say are middle class. That number will climb to about 1.2 billion by 2020. So the challenge for Australia and for Australian firms is to tap into those markets and to say, well, what are the services, what are the goods that we want to sell to that very large and growing section of the Asian Pacific community who will increasingly have more disposable income.
Which do you believe are the sectors in these growing regions that will underpin growth?
Good question, and obviously companies will work that out. But one of the sectors I talk about as a practical example is tourism. So in 2011, some 64 million Chinese went overseas. It's a very big number, isn't it? And our share of that market was just around 0.8%. By 2020, that number will be about 100 million. So if you think about it, if we can get a larger share, even if it's only a few, basis points, few percentage points of what is a growing market, that would be an enormous boost to one of our important export industries, which is tourism.
Absolutely. And is the government doing anything to attract this investment into Australia?
Look, we have a very clear view that foreign investment is good for this country. And on tourism, we've established a fund which is specifically about looking at marketing in the Asian region. So there are lots of things that are being done, but ultimately it's about the private sector. Ultimately, it's about those firms which see this opportunity and say, look, I've got some services that I reckon there'll be demand for over the next years, and I'm going to market them to this market.
And finally, Penny, where do you believe it is the safest place for Australians to put their money?
I don't think ministers should be telling people where to invest, do you? But I think we've got a very strong economy here in Australia, and I'd encourage people to look for those companies that they believe are best positioned to take advantage of the Asian markets.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for your time today.
Good to speak with you.